I'm Steve Henry from New Zealand. It's a pleasure to carry on from the Danes, and to this dynamic around what they're talking about is related to what I think is the four paradigms of education, or how they operate it. And although this diagram is complex and messy, it was drawn by a Malaysian academic who was presenting what Education 4.0 looks like. But you're probably most familiar with 1.0, which is how many of us went to primary school. We had a teacher who was at the centre, and then Education 2.0 is where a lot of current practice happens, where we have experts who are imparting knowledge to people who are largely receptacles. But 3.0 is moving to this idea of students being teachers as facilitators, project-based learning, and 4.0 goes another step where the teacher becomes a walk alongside resource while the learner is constructing much of their own learning as it emerges. That's that. And there are pros and cons of each of these, and they have historically been used for various reasons. I mean, teacher-centered, was very much about so institutions can be designed for scale, so it's fair, everybody gets a fair go, all that stuff, which is good. But one of the disadvantages, of course, is that it's pretty inflexible. And as we are realizing, a lot of people's needs are not catered for in that inflexibility. People who think differently, for example, people who are on the edges of the normal curve, either around the way their brains work, or they might be dyslexic. In New Zealand, 11% of people are dyslexic. That's quite a high percentage of people who are expected to write as the primary communication, for example. So that inflexibility and the exclusion, and that has not worked well with Indigenous people, that method. They're not used to being sat down in rows and told stuff and being compliant as their primary learning method. So pros and cons. 2.0, which is where the majority of education happens in our current context. And at this conference, I've noticed that when we have professors and students and a couple of hundred people in a room being talked at, they're an expert, listening to their knowledge. This is 2.0. And it's a great thing because not the knowledge acts as the connection. It's what you have a shared interest in. You're here today because you have an interest in student agency and what we're on about, and are curious. So that's a great thing. That binds us. But the disadvantage around this is that we get quite siloed if we're not careful in our various disciplines. And I think this way. This theorist drives me. Oh, Kierkegaard, perfect. And we get quite inflexible in our mindset actually around how we. But there's another side of it, which is that the learners can only get the knowledge through the expert. So the expert has the power in the relationship, and that's a key point. And we saw this in the pandemic, how difficult this became for some institutions who shut up shop because they couldn't offer online learning, for example, easily and quickly, so therefore the students couldn't get access to the experts. So these sorts of things changed a lot in the pandemic. 3.0 is where we still have a lot of knowledge being explored, but the knowledge is a lot more curated. And rather than it being, hey, this is my knowledge, I'm the expert in it, so here you go, it's like, which bit of this is actually going to be relevant in these contexts to these people? So there's a lot more curating going on. We have more transparent rubrics and assessment processes in this sort of learning, where the learners can, from the outset, can see what's going to be valued. It's not to say that doesn't happen in these other places, but this is really important it happens here because the learner begins to co-construct that rubric in their project-based learning. And they are becoming an expert in their own context because of the project they're choosing. Does that make sense? And so they may well know more about the expert teacher, about their specialist area, than the teacher would. And of course that's true because of their context, often, right? So some of the other advantages around this is it's a way to bring other knowledges in. It's just not to say that they're the only expert, that there are other experts that can bring that in. Now, good academics working at 2.0 will do this, but not all academics are good, right, at doing that. They get fixed in their perspectives. But One of the disadvantages of 3.0 is like 1 and 2, there's still this discipline focus, and there's not much interdisciplinary thinking, which is really is needed in these unprecedented times of complexity. Things are more complex than they have been in the past. I would argue because of the influence of technology in particular, which amplifies a whole lot of human behaviour. So this is not an easy thing to comprehend. 4.0 is where the learner is placed at the centre, and that is where the learner's context suddenly becomes very important. So this is very difficult to deliver in a classroom. 4.0, it's virtually impossible because unless the group's in a circle and unless the group is sharing very much about their context before you do any content, 2.0 is about content. So it's very important. So I work for an institution which focuses on learners in their context. That these people come and do bachelor, master's and doctorate degree level programs with us. They never enter a classroom. And their context at work, they are the expert in that place, not us as the educator who walks alongside. So this has some advantages. It has high flexibility, which is a very good thing if you are being disrupted by pandemics or by economic crises or war or other things which interrupt institutions which have been stable for a long time. Education 1 and 2 are very institutional and very stable structures, and 3 and 4 are quite disruptive to those institutions. Not intentionally, but you can see that technology has led to 3 and 4 in particular because people have different expectations around how they will receive their learning and why, actually. Where does the power sit? So 4.0 enables more transformational learning, which my doctorate work is around learner transformation and it being a suitable response to disruption in these unprecedented times. There are major crises going on in the world, in many contexts, from social to ecological to financial, which we will need to navigate our way through. Now, I think business as usual, that's linear, is going to have a problem with this. And I saw in the pandemic that the experts were not necessarily respected the way they have historically been. And that's a shift that I'm seeing in our culture, in Western culture anyway. There's some disadvantages of this, of course. It's a high skill set to operate in 4.0 as an educator. You have to let go of your ego and your desire to spread your wonderful knowledge that you have. You need to hold back, as Neil's mentioned before, about the teacher holding this tension between oversharing and, like a good parent who won't tell the child how to do something, they'll set up the environment for the experience to happen in. As an educator 4.0, you need to do that. Of course, this is a big challenge to our current models of campuses and classes and the way teaching is done. It's quite confronting to it. But and that threat needs to be managed carefully, to be seen as a solution to support the development rather than and I'm not dismissing 1, 2, 3 or 4 or promoting one over the other. I'm just suggesting that if we can have these paradigms in our mind, it will enable us to respond more as we develop in different ways, and we can be blended. So that's probably enough from me. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Hikari, who will tell you a bit more about where we work.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks. Right, so we've had some interesting comments up to now. Let me just wind that a bit back. So up to this point, we've heard from Denmark and a very specific flow there, showing the tensions and the shifts of the education system in the context of that. Steve pointed out some of the interesting aspects around moving to education 4.0. And I think it's almost an inevitability. And the reason I'm saying that is that we're working with people these days that know so much more about so many things, and at the same time, so very little. It is fascinating. But because of that dynamic of having access to all of this information, they have a different mindset, and they're also shifting the language, and the language of education should shift with it. So in the past, I think, we mostly spoke about, from a design perspective, about teachers and supervisors. Now, the word supervisor is laden with context. It says, you have a job to do, and I am supervising that job. So I know certain things about the job, and I know what it looks like when it's done and done properly. Teaching in a similar way does that. And the lecturers design the curriculum, and they set the timetables as you would expect from a supervisor. On the other side, where we now and where we're heading is that we're talking about facilitators. In that slide that Steve showed from the Malaysian perspective, you see the teacher or the facilitator now walking next to the learners in education form. They are not in front, looking down or speaking to. So it's independent learning, and I have this thing where I talk about facilitators and mentors, because we are also mentoring people in terms of their thinking skills perhaps, or the exploration of thinking and approaches. So independent learning programs, the learners decide the content because they're the experts, as Steve noted. It's a dramatic show. But these facilitators and mentors ensure the rigor. And that's the important bit. So that we are not being displaced. We are shifting into the role where we have to look after other things. Rigor, for example, and structure. The awarding of the qualification, typically assignments, assessments, and the assessment panel are the experts. So you appear in front, in a classic doctorate, you appear in front of the peer group, and they decide whether you will have the blazer or not. Right? Because they're the experts, and you're the new person coming to show some of your expertise, and they will decide how you get in. On the other hand, we talk about the portfolio of evidence of your learning and experience in a rigorous manner. And we talk about verification, validation, and accreditation as the job of the panel. That's where we're going, rather than an assessment panel. I hope that makes sense. That, when you unpack verification and validation, it covers some aspects of assessment, right? Accreditation is a necessary step, because we need to follow certain procedures legally to say this thing delivers a master's or a doctorate or a bachelor degree. But the learner makes a claim to the degree, and it's endorsed by the experts, the subject matter experts and academic rigor experts in the room. Not so much the panel having the final say. So you can go through this and you can see how the power shifts, and then how the culture shifts. Culture decided by experts, but on this side it's emergent from the learner's culture, and that's where I want to go next. What do we mean by culture? So the diagram on the left-hand side reflects aspects of culture. So it's got age, I'm a bit older. So my culture is different from people from my same group in the same country or the same area, because I'm older than some of the younger people. So I have a shift in my culture. It's still the broad culture is the same, but there's a shift. Gender, sexual orientation, and work will also have nuances in terms of culture. And indigeneity is something that is very important to me, because that tells us more about the place that we come from, our contextual position on the planet, and the influences around us. So for example, in New Zealand, we talk about, most people will introduce themselves through a thing called a PPR, which is telling people their context. And the context starts with their place. It starts with the river that makes up the life-giving water of the place. The mountain as the backdrop, for example. And then it comes into their broader cultural group. For example, it could be a tribe, and within the tribe, subsections of the tribe, finally the closer in family, and finally it comes to the person and their name. So in this case, this is my and it talks about me, but now mine is slightly different to that from someone in New Zealand, because mine talks about my original place in South Africa, where I'm from. So you can hear the accent, right? And I talk about my mountain in South Africa called Tabanshu, which is a pseudonym for the mountain there. And the Garib, which is the river, which is a Khoisan name for the river. So you can see the cultural influences that came into my cultural makeup. And so it goes right through, and then you always end with another greeting to the group. You say, thank you, here I am, this is me, I presented myself. So that is a shift that we need to understand will play a role in education, wouldn't it? Because people talk about who they are, where they're from, and within that context, they come to you and to others to do something special. We'll talk about that. So in principle, what happens between the learner and the facilitator and mentor is that there's an overlap of culture that is shown in this diagram here, and the different behavioral tendencies of these two groups overlapping. And the idea is that we have to come to know each other as we learn about each other, and then learn about the things that we each can bring to the party. So there is this relationship that develops between the facilitator and the learner. So in Maori, for example, there's also a situation where more people in New Zealand, from a Maori perspective, want to be taught by Maori for Maori. So, you know, to deliver some of their cultural context in a way that has meaning to them, that makes sense to them. And so we need to understand that and deal with that. And that will happen in more countries now. It's going to be part of the scenario. Now, what we're trying to do in our context, that is perhaps slightly different from what you've seen from Denmark, that you'll probably see next in Canada's presentation, is that in our case, we're looking for what is called the transdisciplinary and connecting things up. So typically people say, well, you can have this, or you can have that. You can have the Maori way, or you can have the Pākehā way. Pākehā being those people that are not indigenous to New Zealand or the islands, right? And we're saying, I want and. I want both. I want the richness of both. How do we do that? So if I'm a learner, I can say, I want both. I want just this or that. Or I want some composition. And that's what we're about here. So it's all about considering the ways of knowing and respecting it, and finding a place of a new reality that we can construct around those new ways of knowing and doing. And this is my last slide. So when I pull all of these things together that Steve spoke about, and that I spoke about so far, we talk about the concept of ako in New Zealand. It's a Maori word that talks about the interrelationship between this facilitator, mentor, and the learner, and how they interact and teach and learn from each other. So it's reciprocal. And it's a very powerful situation. So the whole idea is that you bring transformational learner approaches, the cutting edge of things, like we've discussed some of the concepts that Niels from Denmark showed. And then we go with the learner's lived experience of the facilitator, and bring all of those together with the cultural context, as we've seen on the previous slide, and our worldview, which is transdisciplinarity. We weave it all together into a new identity, a transformed professional practice identity of learning. Now, yesterday, I was looking at Christian Bush talking about serendipity, and that was fantastic, because I'm like, I should get that into my slideshow, right? Because what is this all about? We're talking about agency. Let me remind you, this is what we're talking about today, is agentic learning, and the different ways that people are seeing it. And he said, look, when there's a situation out there, there's a serendipity trigger, something happens, and then you make sense in a certain way, and he called it the agentic association. So the more agency people have at the end of a process like this, the better their chances of delivering a valuable contribution through this process of serendipity and triggers like that. It makes complete sense to me now. I hope to you too. So we're now going to switch to a presentation by people from Canada, and they will show how there's similarities and contrasting elements, just like we had with Denmark. Ginger.